In the small, dusty village nestled between rolling hills and sparse trees, the morning sun bathed the clay houses and narrow streets in a warm, golden glow. Villagers gathered in the bustling marketplace, where merchants called out their wares, and the air was filled with the scent of ripe fruits, freshly baked bread, and the ever-present aroma of milk boiling over fires. Among the throng of vendors stood Amina, a woman whose presence stirred both curiosity and unease. Amina was known for selling the sweetest, creamiest milk in the village. Her stall was modest, just a simple wooden table with a few clay jugs, but the taste of her milk drew a steady stream of customers. The villagers couldn't quite place what made her milk so unique. It was richer, sweeter, almost addictive. But there was an unspoken suspicion in the air. Something about Amina's milk wasn't quite right. But before we dive deeper into this tale, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Make sure to turn on notifications so you won't miss the next exciting chapter. Despite the steady flow of customers, Amina stood apart, her eyes avoiding the gossiping groups that formed around her. She was a figure of mystery, a woman who kept to herself, a faint shadow of her former self. Years of hardship had worn her features, and the villagers had long whispered about her tragic past. She had lost her husband to sickness, her children to a cruel drought, and one by one, her family had been stripped away from her like leaves blown from a tree. Left with nothing but grief, Amina became an outsider in her own community. As she sold her milk, she could hear the murmurs of the crowd. What makes her milk so sweet, they would ask. Some claimed she added too much sugar. Others speculated she had a secret ingredient. Her eyes scanned the crowd, catching glimpses of distrust and disdain. She knew better than to engage. Her secret was too dangerous to reveal. Her very survival depended on the deceit she maintained. Amina turned her gaze to the horizon, where the sun was beginning to climb higher. She had to sell all her milk today, just like every other day. She couldn't afford to leave with any of it unsold. But deep down, she knew that the thin line she walked between survival and ruin was becoming ever more fragile. The sun dipped low as Amina made her way home, the clay jug in her hands now empty. The path leading back to her small, rundown hut was rough and uneven, bordered by dry grass and scattered stones. As she walked, she reflected on the years of isolation and hardship that had brought her to this point. Her family had once been respected in the village, her husband a strong farmer, her children vibrant and full of life. But after a series of misfortunes, she was left with nothing. And the villagers, who had once offered their condolences, soon began to shun her as if her misfortune was contagious. Desperation had driven her to the old healer at the edge of the village, a man whose face was lined with the marks of age and wisdom. The healer was known for his enigmatic advice, often speaking in riddles and half-truths. When Amina sought him out, her face drawn with hunger and despair, he had listened silently to her woes. She had asked him for a way to survive, to make a living when all other doors had closed. The healer had looked at her with a peculiar glint in his eye. "Add a drop of your own essence to your milk," he said cryptically. "It will make it irresistible." Amina, desperate and with little to lose, had taken his words literally. She had begun mixing a small portion of her own milk into each jug she sold. To her astonishment, the sales boomed. Her milk, now sweeter and thicker, became the talk of the village. As the days turned into weeks, Amina became more and more accustomed to her new routine, though her guilt simmered beneath the surface. She knew what she was doing was unconventional, perhaps even taboo, but she saw no other way to survive. The whispers from the villagers continued, but she had grown used to them. They were the same people who had turned their backs on her when she had needed them most. Now, her secret brought her a modest income, enough to keep her alive. However, the more her milk sold, the more questions arose. Why does her milk taste different from the others? Why does it never spoil as quickly? These murmurs were growing louder, and Amina knew it was only a matter of time before suspicion turned into something more dangerous. She had taken a risk following the healer's advice, and now, that risk was beginning to weigh heavily on her. One evening, as she sat alone in her small, dimly lit hut, Amina's thoughts drifted back to the healer's words. Had he known what she would do? Had his suggestion been a test, or worse, a trap? She couldn't shake the feeling that she had been manipulated, but she had no choice but to continue. Her life now depended on this secret, one she hoped would never be discovered. As weeks turned into months, the marketplace became more accustomed to the taste of Amina's milk. What was once whispered gossip began to morph into a peculiar mix of admiration and envy. Her customers, old and young, spoke of her milk as if it were a rare delicacy, and more villagers started flocking to her humble stall. With her profits steadily growing, Amina was able to replace her worn-out clothes and add a few more jugs to her collection, expanding her modest business. The increased attention, however, brought an unsettling change. Some villagers were no longer content to simply buy her milk. They wanted to know more about her secret. Amina could sense their eyes lingering on her a little too long as they sipped her milk, their expressions tinged with both curiosity and suspicion. Whispers spread through the marketplace like wildfire, and Amina could almost feel the weight of the questions hanging in the air. One morning, as the sun filtered through the dusty streets, a particularly inquisitive woman named Ngozi approached Amina's stall. Ngozi was known for her sharp tongue and sharper wit, a leader among the village women. She leaned in close, her gaze piercing, and said, "Amina, we all want to know, what makes your milk so special? Surely you are adding something that no one else has." Amina met her gaze steadily, her face betraying no emotion. "It's just milk, Ngozi. Maybe it's sweeter because I take care of my cows better than the others," she replied, her voice calm and composed. But inside she could feel her heart hammering against her ribs. Ngozi narrowed her eyes, unconvinced. "I have never seen your cows, Amina. Not once. Perhaps it's time we see for ourselves how you make this milk." A chill ran down Amina's spine. She had feared this moment would come, but she couldn't afford to let her composure slip. "My cows are at the far end of the village," she lied smoothly. "If you're so interested, you're welcome to come and see." Ngozi smiled thinly, but the suspicion didn't leave her eyes. She turned and walked away, leaving Amina to wrestle with her growing anxiety. The crowd around her stall began to thin as the morning rush ended, but she couldn't shake the feeling that her secret was balancing on a knife's edge. That evening, as she made her way back to her hut, Amina's mind raced. She knew the villagers' curiosity would not be easily satisfied. She was walking a dangerous path, and one wrong step could bring everything crashing down. A few days later, the suspicions that had been simmering beneath the surface started to boil over. A small group of villagers, led by Ngozi, began to openly speculate about Amina's mysterious milk. They gathered in corners, speaking in hushed tones, their eyes frequently darting towards Amina's hut. The marketplace, once filled with lively chatter and commerce, now buzzed with a different kind of energy, one fueled by distrust. Ngozi, emboldened by her encounter with Amina, decided to take matters into her own hands. She organized a small group of like-minded villagers who were equally eager to uncover the truth. "She has no cows," Ngozi whispered to the group one evening. "I've watched her home. I've listened. Whatever Amina is selling, it's not cow's milk." The group nodded, their faces a mixture of fear and determination. They agreed to keep watch on Amina, to follow her and find out what she was hiding. They needed evidence, proof that would justify their growing unease. For days, they kept a close eye on her. They watched as she went about her business, scrutinizing every movement. At first, Amina noticed nothing. She was too focused on her routine and her need to sell every last drop of milk. But slowly, she began to feel the intensity of their gazes, the way they lingered a moment too long, the way whispers followed her wherever she went. She felt like a rabbit in a snare, aware of the hunter but unable to flee. One evening, as she finished selling her milk, Amina sensed she was being followed. The shadows seemed to grow longer, and every rustle in the bushes made her heart skip a beat. She quickened her pace, her bare feet padding silently against the earth. She turned a corner and stopped abruptly, her breath catching in her throat. In the dim light, she saw a group of figures huddled together, their eyes fixed on her. It was Ngozi and her followers. "Amina!" Ngozi called out, her voice cutting through the thick silence of the evening. "Why do you rush away so quickly? Are you hiding something from us?" Amina forced a smile, though her heart was pounding. "I'm tired, Ngozi. It's been a long day and I need to rest," she replied. Ngozi took a step closer, her expression stern. "You're not tired, you're afraid. Tell us the truth about your milk or we'll find it out for ourselves." Amina felt cornered, the weight of her secret pressing down on her. She knew she couldn't keep up the deception much longer. "You all want the truth?" she asked, her voice trembling but defiant. "Then follow me." With that, she turned on her heel and walked toward her hut, the group trailing behind her like a pack of wolves closing in on their prey. She had no choice now but to confront them, to face whatever consequences were coming her way. As they approached her home, Amina's mind raced with thoughts of escape, but she knew there was nowhere to run. She would have to reveal her secret one way or another. The evening air hung heavy as Amina led the group to her modest hut at the far end of the village. Her hands trembled slightly as she unlatched the wooden door, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Behind her, Ngozi and the other villagers watched intently, their expressions a mix of anticipation and judgment. Inside, the hut was dimly lit, its sparse furnishings casting long shadows against the mud walls. In the corner, a few jugs of milk were carefully arranged. Amina took a deep breath, her mind racing for a way out, a way to protect the secret that had sustained her. But Ngozi was not one to wait. "Enough of this charade, Amina," she said sharply. "We all know there are no cows. Show us where you get this milk or we will take it upon ourselves to find out." Amina knew there was no more stalling. She felt her throat tighten as she moved slowly to one of the jugs and lifted the lid. The rich, sweet scent of the milk filled the room, and the villagers leaned in, their expressions shifting from suspicion to a mix of confusion and realization. Suddenly, a young boy, eager to impress, pushed forward. He peered closely and, before anyone could stop him, reached out and dipped a finger into the milk. He tasted it, and his face twisted into a grimace. "This isn't cow's milk," he blurted out. It's different." The room erupted into chaos. Voices rose in shock and outrage, the small space filled with a cacophony of accusations and curses. Amina's heart pounded as the reality of her deception crashed down around her. She tried to speak, to explain, but her voice was drowned out by the angry crowd. Ngozi, her face red with fury, raised her hand to silence the others. "You see, I told you she was hiding something. Amina, you have betrayed our trust. You've been selling us your own milk, passing it off as cow's milk." The crowd gasped collectively, horror dawning on their faces as the truth of Amina's actions settled in. They began to shout, their voices filled with disgust and betrayal. "Why would you do this?" one woman cried out. "You've tricked us all." Amina raised her hands, pleading for calm. "Please, listen to me," she began, her voice shaking. "I had no choice. I've lost everything, my family, my home. This was the only way I could survive. I never meant to hurt anyone." But her words fell on deaf ears. The villagers, now united in their outrage, advanced toward her, their faces twisted with anger. "You've made us all fools," another man shouted. "We trusted you and you deceived us. There must be punishment for this." Ngozi stepped forward, her eyes cold and unforgiving. "Amina, you have broken the sacred trust of this community. For that there is only one answer: banishment." Amina's heart sank. Banishment. It was worse than she had feared. Without the protection of the village, she would be left to fend for herself in the unforgiving wilderness. Her breath came in short, ragged gasps as the reality of her situation set in. She had no allies here, no one to defend her. She was alone. The sun was beginning to set as the villagers gathered in the center of the village for an impromptu judgment. A small circle had formed around Amina, with Ngozi standing at its head, her face stern and authoritative. The crowd murmured amongst themselves, some expressing sympathy for Amina's plight, while others, still seething with anger, demanded swift retribution. Amina stood in the center, her shoulders slumped, her eyes downcast. She knew that whatever she said now would likely make little difference, but she had to try. She raised her head, her voice steady despite the tremor of fear running through her veins. "I know what I've done is wrong, but I did it to survive. None of you were there when I lost my husband, when my children were taken by the drought. I had no one left to turn to." A few villagers exchanged glances, their expressions softening slightly. The story of Amina's losses was well known, but many had chosen to forget, to distance themselves from her pain. Yet the majority remained unmoved. The betrayal was too great. Ngozi's voice cut through the crowd like a knife. "Many of us have suffered, Amina. You are not the only one who has lost, but we did not resort to deceit. You have poisoned this community with your lies, and we cannot allow that to continue." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Amina felt her hope dwindling, but she held her ground. "And what about the healer?" she asked, a desperate edge to her voice. "It was his advice I followed. He told me to add something to my milk to make it special. He knew what I would do." This caused a stir among the villagers. They began to look around, some casting skeptical glances at the elderly healer who stood on the edge of the crowd. The healer, an enigmatic figure with deep-set eyes and a face marked by the passage of time, remained silent. his expression unreadable. Ngozi, however, was quick to dismiss the notion. You speak of the healer as if he forced your hand. But it was you, Amina, who made the choice. You could have found another way, but instead you chose deceit. The crowd murmured in agreement once more, the tide of sentiment firmly against Amina. The healer watched silently, his face still devoid of emotion. We will vote, Ngozi declared, her voice carrying the authority of final judgment. Those in favor of banishment, raise your hands. A forest of hands shot up, their faces set in a grim resolution. Amina's heart sank as she saw how overwhelmingly the vote was going against her. She was to be cast out, cut off from the only home she had ever known. But before the decision could be finalized, a young voice broke through the din. Wait, called Cheek, a young man known for his open-mindedness and fairness. He stepped forward, his face earnest. Are we really going to banish her without hearing more? If the healer did suggest it, should we not question him as well? This unexpected challenge caused a ripple of uncertainty among the crowd. Some nodded thoughtfully, while others scowled at the interruption. Amina looked at Cheek, a flicker of hope igniting in her chest. Ngozi, visibly irritated, snapped, Cheek, this is not the time to play the hero. We have all the evidence we need. Cheeky stood his ground. All I'm saying is that if we're going to pass judgment, we should understand all sides of the story. Maybe there's more to this than we know. The crowd shifted uneasily, the certainty of their decision now hanging in the balance. Amina's fate, once seemingly sealed, now hovered in a precarious state of uncertainty. The uneasy murmurs among the crowd continued, growing louder as Cheeky's words began to sink in. For a moment, the tide seemed to turn. Eyes shifted from Amina to the old healer, who stood on the periphery of the gathering. The healer remained a shadowy figure in the twilight, his face obscured by the hood of his cloak. He had always been a source of both comfort and fear for the villagers, a man whose knowledge was respected, but whose methods were sometimes questioned. Sensing the shift in attention, Ngozi stepped forward again, her face set with determination. Very well, she said, her voice loud and clear. Healer, you have been called into question. What do you have to say about this accusation? The healer slowly stepped forward, his movements deliberate and calm, like a man who knew the weight of his words. He pulled back his hood, revealing his deeply lined face and piercing eyes that seemed to glimmer with an inner knowing. His presence commanded silence from the crowd. Amina speaks the truth, the healer began, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the evening air. It is true that I gave her advice, as I have given to many of you. Advice to help her survive in desperate times. But I did not tell her to deceive you. A murmur rippled through the villagers. Some nodded in agreement, finding comfort in the healer's seemingly reasonable words, while others exchanged skeptical glances. Amina's breath caught in her throat. She realized that the healer was playing both sides, maintaining his reputation while letting her bear the full brunt of the villagers' anger. Cheeky, not willing to let the healer off so easily, pressed on. But you knew, didn't you? You knew she might interpret your words this way. You gave her a riddle, a half-truth. Isn't that manipulation? The healer's eyes narrowed slightly as he turned his gaze on Chika. Young man, he said slowly, I give my advice freely. It is up to each person how they choose to use it. I am not responsible for the choices they make. The crowd was visibly torn now, caught between their reverence for the healer and the unsettling logic of Cheek's argument. The tension hung thick in the air. Amina saw her chance. He knew what I would do, she said, her voice rising with a newfound courage. He knew I had nothing left and would cling to any hope. I am guilty of deceit, yes, but not without influence. For the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed the healer's face. He had not expected Amina to fight back with such conviction. The villagers, sensing this moment of vulnerability, began to stir with whispers of uncertainty. The healer, feeling his authority threatened, raised his voice. Enough of this, he commanded. The woman has confessed to her deception. Whether she acted alone or was misguided by desperation, it is clear she has broken the trust of this community. Ngozi, seeing an opportunity to regain control, quickly supported the healer. We cannot let this debate divide us further, she declared. The decision stands. Amina will be banished, but let us also remember to be wary of the advice we seek. This is a lesson for us all. The villagers nodded reluctantly, the earlier fire of their outrage dimming into a simmering wariness. The healer's position remained intact, but his aura of infallibility had been subtly cracked. For now, Amina's fate seemed sealed, but seeds of doubt had been sown. As the crowd began to disperse, Amina felt the cold grip of despair tightening around her. She had fought to change their minds, but it wasn't enough. Her fate was banishment, and she would have to face the harsh wilderness alone. She had already begun to accept this grim reality when she felt a gentle hand on her shoulder. Turning, she found Cheek standing beside her, his expression determined. "Don't lose hope yet, Amina," he said softly. "There are still some of us who believe in fairness, who believe that you deserve a second chance." Amina looked around and noticed a small group of younger villagers gathering behind Cheeky, their faces a mixture of concern and quiet resolve. These were the ones who had been listening, really listening, and who were now questioning the swift and harsh judgment of their elders. Among them were friends of Chike, as well as a few who had always felt uneasy with the rigid traditions that dominated their village. "What are you planning to do?" Amina asked, her voice heavy with exhaustion and a sliver of hope. Chike glanced at his companions, then back at Amina. "We will offer you shelter for as long as you need. They may banish you, but they cannot stop us from showing compassion." "But that's dangerous," Amina replied. "You'll be seen as defying the will of the village. You could be punished too." Cheek smiled, a small, determined smile. "Some things are worth the risk. If we don't stand up now, what kind of community will we become? One that turns on its own at the first sign of trouble? No, we believe there's a better way." The group nodded in agreement, and Amina felt a surge of emotion rising in her chest. She had been so alone for so long that the thought of anyone standing by her side was almost overwhelming. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she quickly wiped them away. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with gratitude. "I don't know how to repay you." "You don't need to repay us," said another young woman in the group. "You just need to stay safe and prove that not all hope is lost. That there's a different way we can be as a village." The decision was made. That night, under the cover of darkness, Cheek and his companions led Amina to a small, secluded hut on the edge of the village, one that had been abandoned and forgotten. Here she would stay for the time being, out of sight but not without allies. As they settled her in, Cheek sat by her side, his expression contemplative. "You know, Amina," he said quietly, "this isn't just about you. It's about all of us. About what kind of village we want to be. Maybe this is the start of something new." Amina nodded, feeling a warmth she hadn't felt in years. For the first time, she saw a glimmer of hope not just for herself, but for the entire village. "Maybe it is," she replied softly. "Maybe it is." The days passed slowly in the hidden hut on the village's edge, where Amina stayed with the quiet support of Chike and the small group of younger villagers. Though she felt a sense of safety among her new allies, the uncertainty of her future loomed like a dark cloud. The tension in the village simmered just beneath the surface. Amina's supporters were seen as troublemakers, their every action watched closely by the village elders and their followers. Word soon spread that the healer, sensing his waning influence, had called for a gathering in the village center. There he intended to reaffirm his authority and the decision of Amina's banishment, warning against the dangers of dissent. It was a calculated move, one that would force Amina's defenders into silence or risk being cast out themselves. Cheeky knew they couldn't let this happen. "We need to confront him," he said one evening, as they gathered in the secluded hut. "We need to expose him for what he is, a manipulator who uses fear and riddles to maintain his power." The group nodded in agreement, but there was fear in their eyes. They knew the risk they were taking, challenging the healer openly, but they also knew that this was their chance to change the narrative, to show the village that not everything was as it seemed. On the day of the gathering, a heavy tension filled the air. The village square was packed, everyone eager to hear what the healer had to say. He stood tall, his presence commanding as ever, his hooded cloak billowing in the wind. He raised his hands for silence, and the crowd fell quiet. "Brothers and sisters," he began, his voice steady and resonant, "we have faced a great disturbance in our midst. A disturbance that threatens the very fabric of our community. Amina's actions have shown us the dangers of deceit and desperation. But there are those among us who would defy the will of the village, who would challenge our unity." At that moment, Cheeky stepped forward, interrupting the healer. His voice was clear and loud. "And what of you, healer? What of your role in all of this? You gave Amina the advice that led her to this path. Did you not see how she might misunderstand your words? Or was that your intention all along?" The crowd gasped. No one had ever spoken to the healer in such a way. The elder man's eyes narrowed, and he turned slowly to face Chica. "You are young, boy," he replied, his voice dripping with condescension. "You do not understand the ways of wisdom. My advice is given freely as guidance. I cannot control how it is interpreted." Chica pressed on, undeterred. "But you knew she was desperate. You knew she had nothing left. You chose your words carefully, leaving room for doubt. You are as much to blame for this as she is." The healer's face darkened, his calm facade beginning to crack. "You overstep your bounds, Chike," he snapped. "This is not a debate. The village has spoken and it has judged." But Cheek did not back down. The village spoke based on half-truths and fear. If we are to be a community, we must be built on fairness and understanding, not manipulation. The villagers, watching this exchange, began to murmur amongst themselves. The seeds of doubt that had been sown earlier were beginning to take root. Amina, watching from the edge of the crowd, felt a surge of hope. She realized this might be her only chance to speak her truth. Gathering her courage, she stepped forward, her voice rising above the crowd. "I followed your advice, healer, because I had nothing left. I trusted you. I believed your words would lead me to salvation. But now I see that I was a pawn in your game to keep us all in line, to keep us afraid." The crowd fell silent, all eyes on the healer. His face was a mask of anger and frustration now, his grip on control slipping. "Enough of this," he shouted. "Amina, you are banished, and those who stand with you risk the same fate." But it was too late. The doubt had spread, and the villagers were no longer as united in their outrage. Some nodded at Amina's words, recognizing the truth in them. Others whispered among themselves, questioning the healer's motives for the first time. Cheeky seized the moment. "We are not asking for chaos or rebellion," he said, addressing the crowd. "We are asking for a fairer, more compassionate way forward. Let us rethink what it means to be a community. Let us not be ruled by fear." The healer, seeing his authority crumbling, tried one last time to regain control. "You will regret this," he warned, his voice no longer calm but filled with a cold fury. "You do not know the consequences of defying the old ways." But the villagers were no longer listening. The old fear had broken, and with it, the healer's hold on them. As the gathering began to disperse, it became clear that the village was no longer the same. The healer's authority, once unquestioned, had been challenged, and his influence had waned. Some of the older villagers still held on to the old ways, wary of the changes Chike and his group proposed. But many others, especially the younger generation, were beginning to see the value in a more compassionate approach. Amina stood among them, feeling a mixture of relief and cautious optimism. She was no longer an outcast, at least not entirely. She had allies now, people who believed in her and who saw her not just as a deceiver, but as a person who had made a desperate choice in desperate times. The healer, sensing his position was no longer as secure as it once was, retreated to the shadows. His power diminished, but not entirely broken. The village was still his home, but it was a home that no longer looked to him as the sole voice of wisdom. In the days that followed, the village began to rebuild itself in small but significant ways. Conversations that had once been dominated by fear and suspicion now leaned towards openness and dialogue. Cheeky and his companions continued to advocate for fairness and understanding, and while not everyone agreed, a sense of change was in the air. One morning, Cheek approached Amina as she stood outside the abandoned hut where she had found shelter. "I think it's time you came back to the village," he said, his eyes filled with sincerity. "There's a place for you here with us, if you want it." Amina looked out towards the village, her heart full. She had thought she would never feel welcome here again, never see a future beyond the shame and the shadows. But now, she saw the beginnings of something new, a chance to rebuild not just her life, but the community around her. "Thank you, Cheeky," she replied softly, a smile breaking through the weariness etched on her face. "I would like that very much." As they walked back to the heart of the village together, Amina felt a sense of belonging slowly returning to her. She knew there was still much to be done, wounds to heal, and trust to rebuild. But for the first time in a long time, she believed it was possible. And so, under the warm light of a new dawn, the village took its first steps toward a future shaped by understanding rather than fear, compassion rather than judgment. Amina, no longer just the secret seller of sweet milk, had become a symbol of change, of what could be achieved when a community chose empathy over exclusion and courage over complacency. Don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Make sure to turn on notifications so you won't miss the next exciting chapter.